Hello, my fellow Americans and non-Americans. Yes, I'm aware that probably at least half of you are actually non-Americans. Um, I'm really sorry about that. There's nothing I can do about that. You just have to be non-Americans. But I want to start tonight's conversation by discussing what it looks like when we are reckless in our justifications. So, because of the uniform and absolute acquiescence to claims of control based on threats of unsafety, we've now set a precedent that whether or not I get to see my mom, for how long, with how many people, where I get to sit, whether I get to hug her, what she has to wear on her head, are all decided by other people. So my mom doesn't have any rights anymore. She didn't want to wear that mask on her head, that visor thing they made her wear. Kept trying to take it off. But normally, if a dementia patient is indicating to you that they don't want to wear something on their head, the support staff would simply take it off. But because of COVID alarmism and the regrettable notion that fear-mongering justifies taking action that arbitrarily enforces rules on people, produces this kind of outcome, this kind of Orwellian nightmare. What are there any values or laws left that we haven't sacrificed at the golden calf of health theater? Thanks, Winston's mom. I'm fine. I'm not really upset about it. Mostly I think of it in terms of argumentation. It's just this is the precedent we set, right? If the possibility, if an increased risk of somebody getting sick is sufficient to force everybody to do meow, 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 then this is what happens. Now all of a sudden, my mom has no rights. And in terms of my relationship with my mom, I have no rights. And my dad has no rights. Now, the thing is, we do have these. You can't really blame the nursing home, right? Because we've got a few options here. Either the nursing home denies access to my mother entirely, which they have for many months, or they allow access as per a jail, which is what they're doing now, or they reject the COVID guidelines and the state shuts them down. So they're not really they don't have any choice. But note the circumstance here. The elderly living in this home, Sunrise, are clients. A majority of them are not dementia patients. They're not in the memory care neighborhood. Did anybody ask the population of their nursing home how they would like the situation dealt with? Did anybody say, let's have a vote on this within the nursing home? How many of you would prefer to have the rules such that you can't come and go anymore? If you go, you have to stay out. And how many of you would prefer that we not enforce that rule, knowing the following realities about COVID? Did anybody ask these people what they wanted? No. And this is what happens when people justify the means with the ends. It's okay that we deem the majority of the population non-essential, whatever it is, whoever they are, whatever they do, isn't valid on my metric, so I can impose my will on them. As a population, we've been given instructions on what to wear on our face, where to stand, how to stand. We've been given instructions not to touch our own face. We've been given instructions not to leave our house. We've been told that if we do leave our house, we're putting lives at risk. We've been instructed that if you're not social distancing, you are somehow wicked or deserve shaming. We've set the precedent that we ought to take action if something might be bad, even if taking action produces outcomes way worse than the purported outcomes of the bad thing. We've set a precedent that we can take massive, arbitrary action, compelling huge swaths of the population to do random things that aren't justified by any solvency at all, even, provided we have something frightening to talk about. So that's where we are with COVID, is what do we learn from this? What advocacies will we not make ever again? You know? Well, the thing is this, Karma's Pimp. My mother is one of those vulnerable populations. She has dementia. She's in a nursing home. She's 83 years old. We're going to be about to be 83 years old. But there's another side to that, right? So you could say the pro-COVID people, the COVID alarmists, are working hard to save her life. But what I'd say is they're working hard to destroy my last months with her, to prevent me from having that important life experience of being with your mother as she's going through her end of life. Now, I think I'm kind of fortunate in that I think my mom's going to linger on for a couple more years. I think I got plenty of opportunity for this. She's mentally quite far along, but physically she's in good health. So, that's that. But imagine a scenario where my mom died last week, and this whole COVID thing forced me to be denied my time with my dying mother on the grounds that it's helping her or saving her life. But the most important thing I want to reiterate here is, did anybody think to ask the clients of the nursing home, each of whom is paying, just like if it were an apartment building, right? The only difference is they've got support staff there. Most of them are not in the memory neighborhood. They are perfectly cognitively functioning people who just usually have trouble getting around, and so they need people to help them get in and out of their wheelchairs and like that, Did the nursing home consider that maybe the clients who pay to live there ought to dictate the rules by some sort of homeowners association vote or something? No. Because, of course, if we allow that the ends justify the means, then the first thing that goes out the window is concern for anybody's rights. It never even occurred to anybody to ask them. Well, we're not worrying about your rights anymore because we're worried about your life. Why don't you worry about your life? Let me worry about my life. Well, if you don't worry about your life the way we say you do, you're putting other lives at risk. Part of being in a free country, part of being a free person in a civil society, is an understanding that we are most safe when we cling most intelligently, which is to say least, to the illusion of safety via control. To the extent that there are circumstances in which we do need to control factors to be safe. Those are closed systems, not open systems like this, not like terrorism. The idea that we can address terrorism by devoting more manpower and resources into anticipating and preventing it is insane. Countless hours and dollars have been wasted in exactly that pursuit. Instead, we should direct our attentions towards being principled, being above reproach, not engaging in the sort of behaviors that create impassioned enemies, for example, not blowing up people's families so that then they become somebody who's a dedicated enemy of the United States. These are basic approaches we can do to prevent terrorism. What we can't do is think that we can surveillance the whole world and surveillance every communication and come up with some sort of algorithm that's going to successfully say, thanks to our secret access to Joe's email, we determined he's a terrorist. That is not any way to stop terror attacks. It is an incredibly stupid, ill-conceived notion. We have to change the way that we understand and relate to risk. There are a lot of heuristics that humans use to make decisions that are based on faulty notions and that lead us astray consistently and that we nevertheless persist in. Well, you see, interestingly, Winston's mom my dad is very practical about the whole thing. I got emotional, and he sort of felt the need to justify himself afterwards as to why he didn't get emotional or something. And he said, well, I guess the reason I didn't get emotional is because I'm on the phone dealing with them every day. I mean, in other words, I guess I'm free from FI because TE. Dad, the point being, neither of us have seen her in months. Whether you talk to the support staff on the phone or not every day is fucking irrelevant, you know? But that's NI-polar for you. And he just sort of, he rolls with the reality as it is. He doesn't seem to grasp the ontological anvil to the head that this whole thing is. Shandy Lear, I agree with you that I've not encountered old people who have indicated to me at all that they think it's important we do this for their benefit. As is always the case when people want to justify the means with the ends, it's almost always for somebody else. Why are you stealing my money? Well, because we have to help those poor people. Well, those poor people didn't say they need help. You're saying they need help. Well, why do you need to steal my money this time? Oh, we have to help these school children with free lunches and stuff. Did they ask for that? I mean, is there any indication that there's a strong demand for that that's not being met? Why aren't their parents feeding them lunch? I mean, basic stuff like that, right? In this instance, it's people who are very much responsive to fear, I guess. A boogeyman was presented, and it was an invisible boogeyman that can get you just by being close to somebody. And because we haven't taught and understood in the world, in the United States generally, that there are acceptable ways to think about policy and make policy advocacies and unacceptable ways to think and make policy advocacies, that no policy advocacy should get out the door unless it meets certain principles, criterions of restraint first, because we haven't embodied that notion, because we haven't settled on a central narrative understanding of how public policy works argumentationally, the slippery slope turned out to be very slippery indeed. So, the first idea that emergent serious virus justifies quarantine is easy enough to get by people, right? Everyone's like, well, sure. I mean, if you got an outbreak of Mia in Mia, then you're going to isolate that community. Sure. Note, of course, that idea is easy enough to get into people's conscience and go, yeah, that's fine. Quarantine in that circumstance, fine. This never was that circumstance. We never had an isolated population that could remain isolated. Instead, we tried to isolate the entire population of people who weren't sick. Note that that's not how quarantines work. But once we've allowed for the possibility that the threat of a viral agent justifies a centralized body turning, causing people's rights to be forfeit on the grounds of their health status, it's a short leap from quarantining sick people to quarantining healthy people, which is what was done. And it's a short leap from this emergency power that's justified because of this brief circumstance of emergent biological threat all of a sudden becomes carte blanche. Well, if it's okay in that circumstance, it's okay in this circumstance, it's okay in the other circumstance, and we see what we have now. That this was not utilized as an emergency power to isolate a sick population and prevent a disease from spreading. Instead, it was used as martial law to divide the population into two categories: essential and non-essential. Right off the bat, you're being told that because your work isn't food related or health related, you aren't as important as people who work in those things, That's a weird thing to say. First of all, note how presumptuous it is. So for the person who owns the sporting goods store, their business is essential to them. It's essential to their family. If I'm training hard for the Olympics and I have to periodically get some new piece of gear, it's essential to me. That's what's essential to me in my life. That's what's most important. Fast food restaurants were open. Well, it's not essential to have someone else cook your food. Why don't we just force everyone to cook their own food? You see, when we designate people as essential or non-essential, there's bound to be a deep unfairness and inconsistency. And once that deep unfairness and inconsistency and arbitrary dictation of order from some centralized authority figure acting extra legally upon every member of the population produces this Orwellian nightmare that we're currently in, where everybody is going along because they're forced to, at least in California, with this absurd health theater called social distancing and masks. Many, if not a majority of people, have it over their mouth and not their nose, so it's not even doing any good. And, of course, nobody can maintain those distances because designating most businesses as non-essential and limiting the amount of people that can go in them means that those businesses that are not so designated become doubly crowded. It's counterproductive, it's arbitrary, it's rights destroying, and it's created an absolute nightmare. And we can lay it at the feet of one central problem. The idea that the ends justify the means. If we should never have gotten out the starting gate here, right? Wait a second. Just because there's a virus going around, that doesn't empower me as the governor of California to tell all the citizens what to do with their own bodies. That's insane. No sane human being would think that. Why didn't anybody say that? There was an entire world of 7 billion people out there when this COVID nonsense was starting. And anybody with a brain would have looked at the data and said the way they are gathering this data means the fatality rate is dramatically lower than they say, and almost certainly less than 0.5%, which is to say less than the average flu. Why did I not hear that from anybody else? Why was I the only one to point out the obvious until months later when the news article started saying what I've been saying all along? And why is it when I said that to people at the beginning, here's the methodology problem, here's what it means, and here's how it's going to play out numbers-wise, why didn't that change anybody's mind? Why didn't anybody respond to it and say, you're right about those numbers, and I'm going to maintain my position for reason X, or you're right about those numbers, and that does change my position, or you're right about those numbers, and it's irrelevant because it's still an ends justifying means thing or something. Why did nobody engage me about the point? It just went in one ear and out the other. No, everybody ignored me, until finally months later, the news said the same thing I was saying. That there are now, except now it's even more dramatic. I read an article the other day that said what I was saying was a good, a conservative maximum of times 10 is now the minimum. Now the news reports are saying it's 10 to 26 times more people infected than has been claimed. 26 times more. And of course, that puts us at under 0.1% fatality rate if it's 26 times more. It's less fatal than the common cold. Now, I said this. You disagree with me about the numbers? I mean, the numbers are clear. Look, Mentos Jones, here's the deal. If you only test the sickest members of a population, and you find out how many of those members die, your fatality rate will be higher than if you test all members of the infected population. That's just logically necessary, right? That if you only test those who are more likely to die, your fatality rate numbers are going to be inflated, right? So it is broadly accepted by mainstream news sources, public health officials, and everything now that the numbers of infected in America are 10 to 26 times greater than those reported. However, the fatality numbers are not any greater than those reported. In fact, they're probably lower because basically public health officials have been scrambling to sort of, after the fact, to justify this bad decision they made. And so they've been kind of hyping up the COVID numbers. I think they're more or less reliable, but I guarantee you there are plenty of deaths that COVID was an incredibly minor contributing factor in, and they attribute it to COVID anyway. So, I mean, Mentos Jones, it's not really possible at this point to disagree with me about this. The facts are in now. The fatality rate is well below that of any flu, as I said it would be. The reason is because of the reason I said. The rights violations are rampant and Orwellian, to say the least. Nobody is being asked to consent to anything. Nobody has an option to opt out of this. Well, my store would like to opt out of this. I will put up a sign so that people know if they don't want to go to a store where it's opted out of this, they don't have to go here. That's not permitted. Why? Because a centralized control mechanism has been applied arbitrarily, lawlessly, extra legally, okay? And without adequate justification. Nobody, even if we were to accept that utilitarian justifications are okay, nobody advocating for this did a real impact calculus. Nobody said, what will the actual impacts be, not just our desired impacts. Everybody who was advocating for this assumed solvency. Understanding argumentation is important. What were people busy trying to establish at the beginning of COVID? They were only trying to establish one thing, one element of an advocacy, namely inherency. They were trying to establish that there was a big problem and just hoping that nobody asked for the rest of their case. Their advocacy, they never established it would have any solvency, and I correctly pointed out that it wouldn't, or so little as to be not worth it. They never pointed out how their solvency, even if they were to attain it, wouldn't be temporary. What happens when you stop locking everything down completely? Won't it just re-erupt again if it's as contagious as you say it is? they never addressed that, right? So they made a case out of inherency. There's a big problem. And that's all they had in their case. And I guess the assumption is, and we need to do something. So they did something. They destroyed the world. And why? Again, very simple. Because when it comes to public policy, anybody who's a TE user, an FI user, or something like that, you need to check first with a TI user if your advocacy is acceptable morally, legitimately, legally, on a principled level. If it's not, you can adjust it and come back and check again. Until it passes muster, it should never leave your lips. You should never voice support for any advocacy until you've checked with a qualified TI user to make sure it passes legitimacy test first. Because when we take action that's illegitimate, we always incur massive harms that usually are unintended. That's the nature of injustice. It bites you in the ass. Every time. This is in Sacramento, this place here that I'm sitting in, this picture that I'm sitting in front of. It's a picture from Sacramento. I decided to go with America because the long and short of all of this stuff, though, is yes, I'm annoyed about COVID, sure. And yeah, I have lots of thoughts about how we need to learn from this, most of all. But more significantly than that, everything that's happening in America right now is I have this personal relationship with it because I've allowed the NI to get into my head so much that I'm aware for what are the omens telling me, what are the symbols telling me, what are the archetypes telling me, and they're all saying the same thing. If you fail, Eric, we all fail. It all falls apart. Is this delusions of grandeur or something? I don't like the fact that Destiny keeps telling me over and over again, you're the only one and you have to do it. And I know it's going to be hard. It's going to take a lot of legwork and you can't wiggle out of this. Okay, well, IG last, it doesn't matter how much you articulated whatever you articulated. If you're in disagreement with my central thesis here, you're part of what needs, you're part of what I'm talking about. We need to see how we can get progress from this. And, there were a shit ton, the vast majority of the people were wrong on this, and at least some of them are smart enough, honest enough, self-aware enough that they can learn something from this. That, hey, Eric called this. If we are unprincipled, we're going to create way more harm than good. And, we can't. The other thing to remember is this. If you're making an unprincipled advocacy, no matter how positive your ends are, my point will be this. Why are you setting such a low standard for yourself? Why can't you come up with a way to solve this problem that doesn't violate principled restraints? Right, I can't really... thank you, Nadrabi expresses it very clearly. I did not know when I undertook this path the nature of it. I understood that it was an increasingly narrowing path. I didn't understand that the wind behind you grew stiffer over time. That it not only wasn't possible to turn back or turn to the side, it became increasingly difficult to stand still. As though the hands of destiny themselves were pressing thorns into my flesh to keep me moving. I mean, I agree, lives are important. The thing is, no matter how much we agree that life is important, until you can establish that life is better served by your advocacy than the alternative, we shouldn't do it. And there are two factors in life. There's sanctity of life, which is important, and there's quality of life, which is also important. Now, on the third level, there's something called autonomy. You believe lives are hugely important. So it should be possible to get you to respect other people's lives and their right to choose what's important to them too. Now you might believe that they might make a bad choice and put others at risk. But remember, those who are very concerned about the risk or vulnerable populations can take the onus on themselves, take extra precautions to keep themselves safe. That's fair and actually upholds life. In other words, it's saying to the person who's a vulnerable population, I respect you. I'm not going to treat you like a child. You can choose to take extra measures yourself. I'm not going to deign to speak for you. I'm going to ask you, do you think this is a good idea, old person, vulnerable population, before I advocate on your behalf? I'm going to ask you, would you like these restrictive measures to be done on your behalf before I'm sure it's a good idea? That's just being decent, right? You didn't do any of that. So as a consequence, the only conclusion you have to make right now is what this has taught me is that I am not qualified to think about policy or make advocacies regarding policy because I'm too influenced by my feelings. Now, Jimmy Weezer, you've misunderstood my progression, I guess. As I was saying before, unfortunately, I'm not in a position where I can either make peace or not make peace with policy prescriptions of any sort, really. The universe is working to create the circumstances where the nation is so hungry, so desperate for a leader with vision and deep honesty that somehow I become president. This COVID thing is an example of a problem. It is not a problem itself. The example of the problem is something called a risk heuristic. And this risk heuristic is a cognitive bias that human beings have that causes them to change how they act based on the knowledge that a risk exists. Of course, that a risk exists is not a good reason to draw any conclusion at all. It's possible, for example, that a black hole will start up near Earth and kill everybody. A risk exists. Because humans are subject to this fallacious risk heuristic, knowing that risk exists makes it more likely than zero that humans will take efforts to prevent it from occurring. Of course, we should never, ever, ever take any action regarding any risk until we understand the specifics of it. What's the probability? What's the magnitude? What's the time frame? What's the cost in stopping it? What are the unintended consequences? Do we have to sacrifice any principle of restraints? And what precedent does that set? So right now, the COVID alarmists have set the precedent that if I say something scary, then I get to tell you whether or not you can hug your mom. And if you don't obey me, we will kick her out of her home that you paid for her to live in. So remember that even if you think it was important we do something, that you should blame yourself for not being smart enough to come up with a way that didn't cause so much rights violation. You may believe it's acceptable, based on what you think is important, to force your opinion on everybody else. But if you do that, first of all, it better fucking work, right? Because if it doesn't, you're going to end up with a lot of mad people who told you in the outset this is a bad idea, and you ignored them. You didn't go by the normal rules of reciprocal burdens. You weren't willing to win the argument first. You forced the action on everybody before we could have the argument. The voices that have the platforms in the mainstream media have pitched lie after exaggeration after spin. It's been as consistent as weather on Mars, on Jupiter, which is very inconsistent. Of course, people making those advocacies, right? What you hear now is, well, if we had done it right, the thing is, it's your job as the advocate to anticipate not just what you want to happen, but what will happen, and to account for it in your impact calculus when you're making your advocacy. If you didn't do that, well, you have no business ever making advocacies again. After all, you supported something that was disastrously bad because your Dunning-Kruger effect meant that even though you know absolutely nothing about argumentation, policy, thought, reason, or anything else, you felt perfectly qualified to force everybody to agree with you. Winston's mom, there is no plan for this pandemic that could possibly have been executed that would have resulted in anything other than what we have right now. Okay? The epidemiologist had worked for decades on a plan for what to do about a virus with a 0.4% fatality rate? Are you sure about that? Did it look like martial law? Because, they certainly weren't planning for this virus unless they knew about it in advance, right? And if they were planning a martial law response as appropriate to a viral threat, would they have set a standard for what that viral threat's significance needs to be before this martial law rule kicks in? And if they had such a rule, would this virus qualify? Absolutely not. This wasn't done against any standard. How could you implement a plan when obviously nobody would make a plan to deal with a virus with a 99.6% survival rate? Come on. Think. When your plan goes badly, you don't blame the people who didn't implement it the way you wanted it to. You recognize the fact that you didn't actually anticipate what would happen. You just articulated what you wanted to happen. Well, that's bad TE. That's terrible public policy. And it's unacceptable in a civil society as a justification for forcing everybody to go along with your bullshit. Period. It's wicked. We have to be responsible for our own advocacies. TE is not an excuse for wickedness. There is no point. There's no conspiracy here. This is not a plan. This is what you call the amazing destructive power of cumulative stupidity. It's also what you might call the death of the proper constraint narratives that used to define our discussions about public policy. It used to be commonly accepted by every thinking person that the ends do not justify the means. It was beginning spot number one. That was way, okay, well, we can't do that because the ends don't justify the means. And everyone goes, oh yeah, that's right. No more. So, Mentos may come in and want lives a lot, but he doesn't care about anybody's life at all. Because he'll sacrifice anything as a means to get to his desired end. So he doesn't care that his advocacy resulted in, now I have a relationship with my mom as though she were in prison, that she's lost all of her rights to even control what's on her head, that she's lost the right to touch or hug her family members, that she only gets to see us every few months, and that she's robbed from me and my father this opportunity at an end of the life period of time. I'm just one story. How many suicides can we link directly to this? How about all the rioting? How about all the damage? If you want to enforce this thing for months and months and months, a quarantine on healthy people, remember, what rights does it violate? Well, first of all, it violates the right to free assembly. And in fact, when people did try to assemble in defiance of COVID rules, as long as the politics were right, if it was Black Lives Matter, nobody complained. Everybody said, oh, that's fine. That's important, though. But if somebody tried to go to a church service, then they got written up in the paper as 30 people who attended church service in defiance of COVID rules contract COVID. Again, once you've walked down the path of arbitrary, unjustified bullshit, anything goes. You've already shaken hands with the devil. You just walk down the path and excuse another thing. Well, I know we had to maim all those toddlers, but I mean, we're saving lives. You justify anything. So that's why we need to change the way we think about public policy. Yeah, I mean, exactly. Karma Pimps has a point here. Now, why don't we use this to justify constraints on people as a way of treating climate change? Climate change is a big public health threat, of course, right? Well, of course, I'm the person who has the correct policy on climate change as well. Climate change is real. Climate change is anthropogenic, and it makes absolutely zero sense to attempt to mitigate climate change. Any such attempts with carbon caps are almost assuredly going to backfire, as China, India, Brazil, Russia manufactures the same goods to fill the needed niche in the marketplace in dirtier ways and pollutes more in the process. The engine of well-being is prosperity and autonomy. Left to their own devices, the people of California would be busily, industrious, accomplishing things, serving the common good in all their unique different ways, all of which are essential to them, who are just as important as you. There is no point to this, right? The point is just that it's a consequence of allowing our discursive habits as a species to fall into such a shameful and shabby state of disrepair. People do not know how to talk meaningfully about public policy. People do not get that when they're advocating for, they're really advocating that the government decide when you can hug your mother. Like Winston's mom, when she advocated for this. Mentos Jones, when they had advocated for this. IG Last, when they advocated for this. They didn't know, never even crossed their mind, that they were advocating that we pass a law that says, from now on, government can arbitrarily tell you whether or not you can hug your mom. All they have to do is point to any unsubstantiated, arbitrarily described risk. And it's justified. Well, whoever advocated for it, I don't know. Right, that's absolutely how it's played out, Lawnmower. I'm not somebody who thinks there's like a war on Christmas or war on Christians or any of that stuff, but it sure has looked like it in the media, because I have read multiple stories about some horrible, conservative, non-thinking preacher who insisted on holding service despite the COVID things, and his people in his congregation contracted COVID. And then you don't hear any of that about the Black Lives Matter things. In fact, I read an article about Black Lives Matter protests in which an epidemiologist tried to claim that, with incredibly specious reasoning, that somehow Black Lives Matter protests weren't responsible for any COVID transferring or infections and spreading COVID and stuff. It was just, remember, there are reciprocal burdens. You may not like me when I'm disagreeing with you, but remember, when they come to force you to do something for arbitrary reasons you don't agree with, I'll be there on your side too. So, in any given instance, people who need my protection are going to try to hurt other people. Those other people need my protection too. So I'm going to stand up for those other people. But the good news is, when your arbitrary reasoning works against you and the precedent you set is used against you, because now it's okay, I'll be there to argue against the bad guys then too. My only hope is, at that point, you'll recognize what I'm saying, internalize it, and accept that no matter how tempting it might seem to you because of your attentional manners, we cannot determine policy by predicting outcomes and ignoring processes by which we get there. Or else, we will create a totalitarian morass of a nightmare. No, I haven't seen the George Floyd footage. I mean, the thing is, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether the George Floyd case was X or Y or anything else. It is the case that the police frequently use excessive force and kill people whom they don't need to kill. That the apprehension of a suspect should be quick and involve as little force as possible, even if the suspect does something that allows, on some sort of technicality, the police to use more force. The problem we have is that police officers want to take advantage of those technicalities so they can beat people up. And that needs to stop. They end up killing people. That needs to stop. You know, if a cop absolutely has to kill somebody, then okay, that might happen sometimes. But it better be so abundantly justified that no sane person would disagree with the cop. The cops should be so eager to share all the information about it to prove and vindicate or prove guilty, well, either way, the cop, that we're all, that we don't even have a chance to ask for all the footage before they release it all, you know? The cops need to show that they are on the side of truth and justice, not on the side of defending their own. So it doesn't matter what happened with George Floyd. And the Black Lives Matters people, it doesn't matter if they're right about any particular central issue about the police. Again, it doesn't matter if it's not done properly, if the arguments aren't made right. So Black Lives Matter is doomed to fail. Why? Because they're not talking about the issue that's real. The real issue is police reform is necessary. Instead, they've got it backwards. They said race is important, but we know that's not true. And you never help yourself in the long term with things that aren't sustainable, substantiatable, and sustainable over time. You will never help yourself if you're making arguments you can't sustain. Just because the idiot in front of you can't think of an answer to it doesn't mean it will sustain scrutiny over time. And the time will come when you are called out on your bullshit and you'll realize that it was a mistake. That is the moment when you need to be honest with yourself. So if you are an advocate in favor of COVID shutdown and shit, you need to be honest with yourself now. You were wrong. And if you heard me talking about it before, you had the information you needed to be right and you chose to be wrong. And you contributed to this problem. So you need to adjust so that next time we don't make this mistake again. Right? Well, I mean, the thing is, Mentos Joe's, we got two choices. Everyone's going to be a shit ton of people are going to be upset, and individuals will be able to do what they want and make their own choices, and rights won't be violated. Or we can have a bunch of people upset and give them really good reasons to be upset by violating their rights left and right. Obviously, the former is preferable to the latter. So it's like, I don't understand why people are getting so upset. Well, the thing is, we could have a conversation about safety and health and stuff like that, and what reasonable people might be willing to reasonably do if you hadn't already forced it on us, right? You gave up the opportunity to have a reasonable conversation by being a tyrant. So I don't have reasonable conversations with a tyrant about anything. And when a tyrant tries to force me to do what I might be willing to do myself if unforced, then when unforced, I will refuse to do it absolutely out of principle. I don't like being forced. So that's the other outcome you created, right? So when you bring your TE shit into the mix and decide to force people, do you account for the outcome of what's going to happen because you forced them? They will hate you. They will think you're a wicked person. People don't like being forced. And when it turns out you were wrong in your justifications, they're going to hold you to account for it. Did you think about that when you were making your advocacy in the first place? Hey, if I force everybody and I'm wrong, or even if I'm right, they're going to hate me. They're going to be unwilling to do any sort of cooperative thing. If you believe in community, if you believe in a civil society, then you believe that people, you, me, other people, you believe that we can reach consensus. You believe that we can know best for our own selves, what's best for us. We believe that you are no more above the law than I am. So, the thing is, it's like there's what I keep hearing is from people. It's like, well, what's the big deal? Just put on the mask. I mean, it's not asking very much. That's the problem. It was never asking. So, if you say, hey, do you mind if I play this video briefly in the background while you're talking to Joe? Even though it's going to be disruptive. Okay, fine. If you force me through active disruption, ignore my objections, refuse to listen to me, don't respond to my arguments, compel me to suffer through shit tons of you blasting background noise at me for a long time, then finally concede that that's a bad thing to do. When you're done, you turn off the ghetto blaster and you stop blasting your noise at me. Don't go, okay, well, hey, instead of forcing it this time, how about if I just ask you to take it? Would that be okay? Is that better? Fuck off. If you wanted to have a conversation between civil human beings who are equals and who are reasonable, members of a liberal democracy, who are sane and intellectual people, then you wouldn't have started by forcing me. You would have started by having a real conversation, by addressing what I was saying, by withholding action until you knew something. Appeal to ignorance is never a justification for action and always produces horrible outcomes. We didn't know that any of those Japanese in World War II who lived in America, any of them could have been a terrorist. They might have been spying for the Japanese. They might have been saboteurs. So that's okay, therefore, that we gathered them all up and put them in a camp. Right? Same thing here. I mean, why not gather up all the non-essentials and put them in a camp to keep them safe? We can make their cells 6 feet apart. And we can force them to wear masks at gunpoint so that, they don't run the risk of making the essential people sick. IAG last, I'm hopeful. For example, what this indicates to me is that you haven't dwelled on it long enough at all. In fact, you haven't had your moment where you accepted and came to terms with what you've done and made an effort to improve. So Alcoholics Anonymous tells us that when we were wrong, we promptly admitted it and made amends where necessary. Until you can do that, I'm going to continue to use this opportunity, this topic, as an opportunity to help other people grow in their discourse. I don't want your failing to learn something this time to be party to you repeating this mistake or possibly causing massive harm to people just out of ignorance or an unwillingness to be honest. So you know, I appreciate the fact that you're revealing that you're uncomfortable about this issue now. That's a starting spot. What you need to do is sort of have your come to Jesus moment. Go into the mirror and say, Eric was right. He was right the whole time. And my approach to this is suggestive of an incredible arrogance that I know better for other people than they know for themselves, and that it's okay for me to force people to do things based on my arbitrary opinion. And I don't know how I got to be this place. I don't know how I got to be this kind of person, this kind of douchebag, but that's not what I ever envisioned for myself. When I was a little kid, I didn't imagine I was going to be a heroin addict. I didn't dream of myself being a mass murderer, and I didn't dream of myself advocating horrible, rights-destroying, ill-advised, non-solvency-oriented policy either, because I understand that as a member of a citizen democracy, I too have responsibilities. No, I'm saying IG left. I'm not saying you advocate them still. Like a lot, like almost everybody. When I first was telling the truth about COVID, I had maybe one person agree with me. Definitely not you. Now, that's what I'm talking about. Your change of perspective on this is what you need to focus on. What does that teach you about how to process? Okay, well then maybe you're not on this list. It doesn't matter. The vast majority of people are on the list. If you happen to be somebody who's not, congratulations. But you're clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation if you're unwilling to or uninterested in hearing anything about how we need to address what it teaches us. Okay? Since I wasn't heard last time at the beginning when I talked about it, we're going to make sure we post-mortem it well so that everybody who got it wrong learned something. Okay, my bad. I falsely accused you of, at one point, advocating in favor of this. I did not know that for sure. I concluded that based on some of what I read from you, but I hadn't read everything you wrote, so my intuition led me astray, and I intuited that you had supported it originally, but I was wrong. My bad, I stand corrected. Okay? This is how people who advocate in favor of COVID need to deal with it. They need to be honest instead of clinging to their lies. When you cling to a lie, it's like a rock in the ocean. It will drag you to the bottom of the sea and drown you. I mean, IG last. Remember, discussions don't achieve things. Statements have rhetorical slope. So, the slope of my statements are straight downhill, which means to the extent that anybody hears them and internalizes them as an object of analysis, it will prompt dramatic change in them or dramatic improvement of what they already understand. In other words, it's a powerful instigator of cognitive dissonance when people have explained to them extremely well why their approach to a given thing is wrong and are nevertheless attached to it. You want to create as much cognitive dissonance as possible to make it uncomfortable for them to maintain that lie. You can't convince people by being persuasive. You can convince people by making wrongness painful. So it's like if somebody makes a wrong argument and gets burned badly, chances are they'll shy away from that argument, even if they don't understand. The problem with trying to be persuasive with argumentation is that requires people to understand, but not everybody can understand. Not everybody has TI in the mix. If I'm an ESFP, chances are I simply cannot understand, no matter how hard Eric tries to explain it. So that's why it's important to make wrongness painful. You know, we wouldn't want to we wouldn't want to somehow allow our child to make a bad decision and as a teenager, like, trust somebody and then insist they learn nothing from it, right? We'd have to be okay with the fact that the girl's crying and she's really broken up over this relationship thing, that's the natural consequence that she incurs for being too trusting and or going for the wrong guy and stuff, and that it's part of her growth experience, part of coming of age. She's going to learn that pain is to be avoided and that there are methodologies to avoid it and methodologies to seek it. What I'm saying is, let's not seek it. Let's not. Let's avoid it instead. It's a more sensible approach. I agree. It would be good if politicians could be open and honest without fear of losing their position. But look at Trump. The problem is people don't evaluate things on their merits. They use heuristics. So, is Trump a liar? Yeah. Is Trump a terrible president? Yeah. Is most of what Trump says bullshit and you should oppose it? Probably. Was he right about COVID? Yeah. And, we can't make an ad hominem fallacy. That's a real ad hominem, to say that I can know his policy is bad because of who he is. Now, of course, this also reveals how critically important it is not only that you be right, what's very much more important than that is that you justify it in the right way. When Trump told us that he was correct because of his hunch, every sane person said, I can afford no weight to his conclusion because his reasoning was poor. That doesn't mean we should think the opposite conclusion is true. It turns out he was right, and people made the fallacy because he had reached his conclusions in an erroneous manner, that his conclusions were invalid. Logic isn't like reality in that fashion. In reality, it's true, because the COVID policy was reached in an illegal manner, in an extra-legal manner, in an unacceptable, unprincipled manner. As a matter of fact, none of the impacts are legitimate, and it creates nothing but bad impacts. If we had put the onus on the individuals, then individual people would be making an actually authentic effort to worry and protect about those members of their family who are in vulnerable populations. Instead, we have everybody resenting this forced, pointless health theater and resenting, without really understanding why, the fact that they did the crazy idea, the insane thing that it should never, ever, ever, ever be even dreamed of, quarantining the healthy. What? You're going to quarantine the healthy, and you're going to blow dry the dehydrated, and you're going to immerse the drowning in a bath of warm water, and you're going to put out the fire by pouring gasoline on it. What? It needs to be some understanding that when we allow But look, COVID is just one of the problems that the country faces. All the problems the country does face collapse down to the same problem. Our civics education needs to include political philosophy. what comprises legitimate political action, what does not. What are the risks of allowing illegitimate action because of a purported emergency? We should never forget the lessons of the Japanese internment camps. It was World War II. After all, the threat was so huge. We were at war. I mean, we have to err on the side of caution, right? No, we don't. We err on the side of legitimacy. Even if we had not interred the Japanese and one of them had turned out to be a spy or a terrorist or a saboteur or something, the harms incurred by interring the Japanese vastly outweighed any harm that a specific saboteur could possibly have done to the country. In other words, by selling out the rights of the citizens to possibly protect their safety, that's the justification for it, we guarantee to kill the thing we're protecting. You know, it's that old TE approach. It says, look, the donkey's eating too much. It's too expensive. We can't keep feeding the donkey so much. Okay, I'll train him to not need to eat any food. And then the TE person is shocked when they finally finish their training protocols and train the donkey not to eat anything, and it dies. Why did it die? Because the TE person did not use a legitimate means of addressing the problem. They ignored constraints and just focused on solvency. If you don't care about anything but solving your problem, then donkeys are going to die during the making of this movie, you know? Trump has been awful. I mean, there's no disputing that. I'm not a Trump defender. He's somebody who doesn't understand the need for constraint. He's expanded the office of the presidency well beyond even what it was expanded by previous presidents who had already expanded it way too much. And he basically is trying to claim the powers of a king. He has only the courts to restrain him at all, and the courts are seeming to do a fairly poor job of that, frankly. One would hope the voters would replace him in 2020, but unfortunately, we have no viable alternative candidate. Even I think that Trump might be better than Biden, because Biden, I think he's on the edge of tottering, you know. I mean, not that Trump's not, but less so than Biden. So what am I going to do about it? That's the question. And well, the answer is, I've got to be responsible for this shit. I got to go make my way across the country. I got to explain to them that it's time for us to reclaim the citizen democracy, put somebody in office who is fair and just and knows what he's doing. That no matter what your pet issue is, I might not do what you want me to do, but I'll protect you when you need me to protect you. In other words, I won't let the other special interest groups get you any more than I'll let you get any other special interest group. So you might be mad at me as a citizen because I don't want to do the thing you want to do. But you'll be grateful you voted for me when someone else wants to do something to you, because I don't want to do that either. Okay? I want to keep your autonomy, your liberty as appropriately cordoned off as possible, which is to say, the federal government should attempt to fill its designed role of a federation overseer, you know? No, I don't have a gun. I don't like guns. To be honest, I don't exactly trust myself with a gun. I don't really trust myself with physical objects in general. I know I'm bad with physical objects. I can barely walk through a room without knocking something over. Why would I think I qualified for a gun? We have a gun here at the house. I mean, my dad has a .22 rifle. It's in the closet in there. And if if circumstances were uniquely compelling and slow developing, I suppose I would retrieve the rifle from the closet and load it and prepare to, for whatever appropriate use I brought it out for. But I suspect that whatever I might want to do with a gun, by the time I got it out and loaded and everything, it'd be too late. Usually, if you need a gun, you need it right now. You don't need it 10 minutes from now after you've figured out, or it's the same gun my dad's always had. This has always been in his closet for as long as I remember. No gun safes in our house. He had a 22 rifle, bolt action, with stacks of ammunition next to it in his closet. That's how he's always stored it. So when I was a kid, of course, on one occasion, I went and got it out, loaded it, and shot it into the ground in the backyard. The only time I shot it. I was under strict instructions not to touch it, But yeah, I'm an intuitive. I'm not good with physical objects, and a gun is a pretty dangerous physical object. I wouldn't mind having one in general as a tool in case of emergencies, so to speak, to bring out, but it wouldn't be something I'd want to touch very often. Or I certainly wouldn't want to play with it. I wouldn't want to go take it out and shoot targets or whatever. That's it doesn't sound fun to me, and it sounds like a hassle, and you have to buy more bullets then. I'm just not into guns. I don't know. The last time I shot a gun, it got Taylor into trouble. I was in Kansas. I was visiting Kansas, where they have the loosest gun laws in probably I wouldn't say the world, but the country, because some places like in the Middle East or Africa don't have any such laws. But anyway, in Kansas, they've got extremely loose gun laws. There's no concealed carry law. So, Taylor asked me, hey, would you, I waited till my parents were gone before I shot it, and they never found out about it. I never got called out on it. So I must have successfully hidden it well enough. Okay, so, right. He said to me, hey, do you want to carry a pistol with you into Walmart, in the waist of your pants? And I said, yeah, okay. He gave me a handgun. I tucked it into my sweatpants. I had this broken flip-flop. That's why I needed to go to Walmart in the first place. So I needed to replace my flip-flops. And, I looked like quite an odd character walking into that place, I'm assuming. I had a big beard at the time. I had just gotten that sexy hat. I had that on. I was pimping that hat like a champ, and I was limping because I had to kind of slide one of my feet so my flip-flop wouldn't fall off because it was broken. And I had on sweatpants and a shirt, and I went in this store and I was kind of thwacked out, Apparently the store detective was following me the whole time. I was, of course, oblivious to this, but at one point the gun fell down my pants to my ankle. I had to reach down there and pull it back up and put it back in my waistband. And then what did I end up buying? Of course, I bought things like stickers and stuff, fun art project stuff, stickers, pens, and doodads that you can decorate stuff with. Meanwhile, Taylor's shopping at the gun section and the hardware section and stuff. I like the hardware section too, but in this instance, I was looking for art project stuff. And Walmart must have thought I was a very strange guy, because then when I did get up there, I had a big roll of cash with me for this cross-country trip, so I was just like, here's $100. Just what's this guy's story? Well, I'm a YouTuber who's thwacked out of his head. Hi. So anyway, after that, Taylor and I went to his friend's farm, which is private property, and he let me shoot this Glock, which is a kind of handgun. And it said on it, it had engraved on it, the words of the Second Amendment. So anyway, I was shooting this gun. I was trying to shoot a bird, you know. So the first thing I did was I had the gun. He's like, okay, here's the gun. Here's the safety. Here's blah, blah. So I was very careful, always pointing it away from me and towards the ground, you know. And I said, hey, look at that pond over there. Can I shoot at those birds on the pond? They're sitting on the pond. They look like geese. They were geese-like creatures. Okay, let's call them buzzards. Buzzards with an oddly goose-like appearance. Okay, or at least a goose-like sound. They kind of honked like geese. Anyway, so naturally, you know, Taylor said, "Yeah, you could shoot over there. That's the safe direction to shoot. That's the direction we're generally gonna shoot. You could shoot at those birds on the water." So, you know, I took my handgun, which is not really designed for shooting birds, I guess, and I fired off 4 or 5 shots at these geese on the pond. There was a lot of geese on the pond. I figured, I can't miss. I just got to shoot in that general direction. I'm bound to hit one of these geese. No such luck. Anyway, the geese all fly away. I'm like, oh well, whatever. I spend the rest of the time there stalking around in the trees trying to find any bird that I can direction between me and the direction I'm supposed to shoot at, and trying to shoot these birds. Let me tell you something. If you ever tried to shoot like a finch or a sparrow or something with a Glock, it's a bit of a challenge. Okay, I'm pretty sure that if you were a professional bird shooter, you would get something like a rifle with a scope on it. Even at like 10 feet away, or even, you know, maybe even a little less, and I'm pointing right at this one bird on this branch. I didn't hit it anyway. I didn't ever hit anything. So anyway, that was fun and blah, 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 blah. Well, Taylor, turns out, had been filming my attempt at shooting the birds on the water and published it onto the YouTube channel, which is fine. You know, he had like manager access or whatever. I'm glad I didn't do that, because it ended up being the pièce de résistance in the subpoena for that the affidavit that the law enforcement in Pratt County presented to a judge to get a search warrant for Taylor's house. In my opinion, it was the only thing on the affidavit that actually gave the judge good legal justification to sign the search warrant. Everything else was just supposition. But they had evidence of me shooting at what sounded like geese, and so they searched his house looking for dead geese or other indications that geese had been illegally taken or molested. Turns out, I guess you weren't supposed to shoot at those geese. I mean, how the fuck am I supposed to know what you're supposed to shoot at? That's why I asked Taylor, you know. Can I shoot at those things? I asked him if I could shoot at them. He said, yeah. I didn't know you couldn't shoot at those things. I guess, according to the you know, Kansas people or whatever, it's some sort of crime to molest migrating geese. So, if that's your fetish, be aware someone might make a federal case out of it. Okay, I'm going to have to wrap this live stream up right now, and the reason is primarily because my computer wants to restart, and it keeps like telling me to restart it, and also that like the streaming software will say like, oh, you're asking me to do too much processing, and I'm having trouble keeping up. Give me that kind of message, which is not normal at all, except for the fact that I've got this other message here saying you need to restart your computer. So I'm gonna end this live stream and restart the computer and stuff. I'm probably gonna try to get a good night's sleep tonight, and it's only 1:43, and then I'll talk to y'all on the mañanas. Okay, thanks for being here. Don't forget to eat plenty of American